The first question will be a 15-second question. We'll start with Mr. Fenwick and go around, then finish with Mike Farruggio. Do you think Charlottesville City Council is heading in the right direction, or do you think things have pretty seriously gotten off on the wrong track? Mr. Fenwick.
All right, 30 seconds, is that
15.
15-second response? I think it's heading in the right direction. We have people come into our community from all across the country. It is one of the top-rated cities in the country. And to say that Charlottesville is somehow lacking is like if you're a student and you give your professor a paper and he grades it as A, and then he comes back to you and says, A is not good enough. We want it to be A+. Now that's fine to have a goal as being a little better than it was before, but it's a beautiful city.
Yes, I think we're on the right track. I think, I ran for office in the first place because I thought there were things we needed to do better. We've been named a top place to start a business, to retire, to raise children, most livable city, tree city. So I think we're one of the only AAA rated cities, so our fiscal house is in order. And I think that we need to do more to improve equity in the city, but I think we're on the right track.
Colonel Weber.
The City of Charlottesville works well for many people and many of the children in public schools, but in many ways we're not on the right track. As I mentioned, there's a large segment of our community that is left behind, and they're continuing to be left behind with a lot of the development that's going on in the city. I think we can do better.
Mr. Farruggio.
I agree. I believe we must do better. I believe the city of Charlottesville has all the resources we need to be everything that we want to be. However, our policies in the past are holding us back. You look at the cost of living increases, you look at how we've handled taxes and how we've handled spending in the past 15 years, we definitely can do better.
The next question will be a 1-minute question starting with Mrs. Szakos. On the school report card scale of A to F, how would you rate city government's handling of the Occupy situation in the fall of 2011 and why?
I think it was a really interesting experience for all of us. It was something that hadn't happened in Charlottesville before, and I think we were all learning as we were going. We have a constitution in this country that we believe in, that I take very seriously. We have a right to free assembly. We have a right to free speech. And those were things that were weighed against the rights of people to feel kind of comfortable with how things were going. And I think that those came into conflict, and it was a struggle for a lot of us. I defended the right of the Occupy folks to be there, and was glad for finally a peaceful resolution, although I think that there were arrests at the end, which I found unfortunate, but they did go peacefully. But I think that the people who were doing Occupy were giving some serious statements about, especially about national policy. It wasn't so much about local issues as it was about national issues, and I think those things needed to be said.
And your letter grade?
I would say C.
Colonel Weber.
What was the grade scale?
A through F.
A through F, I would give it an F. While I appreciate the Constitution and their right to assembly and free speech, there have always been time, place, manner restrictions on that. The government can do that. This happened to be a public park. It was open to the public, and they occupied that for a number of weeks. They had to get waivers to do that, and it basically closed the park to the rest of the public. So anybody that wanted to walk through the park or just use it for recreational purposes, they essentially couldn't do it. I think that was wrong to do that.
Mr. Farruggio.
I agree. I would give it a D. I mean, there are some things that we did right, respecting the right of assembly, respecting the freedom of speech, allowing the debate, allowing Charlottesville to express itself was a great thing, and that was important to do. But when we talk about allowing them to occupy a park all the time where nobody else can use it, that's just unreasonable. There's people that live in that neighborhood that want to use the park and they couldn't. People that wish to walk their dogs there every day and they couldn't. We wanted to give them porta potties. We wanted to give them electricity. We wanted to bend over backwards to allow them to display their displeasure, and it was just going a little too far. There were other ways that we could have handled it, and then when it came down to the very end and we had to take them out of the park, the fact that we would, as a government entity, get in the front line, be photographed defending those people when they were given a lawful order to leave the park was just over the top, in my opinion, over the top.
Mr. Fenwick?
All right, so we had to bend over backwards to give them their rights. Well, how generous of us. I'm going to raise the average. I'd give it an A. Those young people out there, and I knew many of them, were verbalizing what many of us felt, a disconnect with our government, national, state, and local. So I think the city showed restraint. I think they showed patience. And, you know, I can walk my dog somewhere else besides the park. That really didn't bother me. So it ended up a peaceful demonstration, and I support it.
The next is a 2-minute question, beginning with Colonel Weber. Do you think crime and aggressive panhandling on the downtown mall are A, not a problem, B, a little problem, or C, a significant problem? What, if any, new measures would you propose to deal with those situations? Specifically, would you propose giving law enforcement officers increased authority to curb aggressive panhandling?
Well, first of all, I would say that the city has an aggressive panhandling ordinance that's under challenge right now in court, and so with regard to the legality of it, that's to be determined. But my review of the case law that backs up the ordinance is that the ordinance will ultimately be held to be constitutional. And so the answer to your question is yeah, I do think it's a problem because any sort of aggression and aggressive behavior and panhandling, whether you like it or not, is an approach to a person. You make eye contact with the person and you come at them in a way that can feel very, very threatening to a lot of people. And I just don't think that's appropriate in our downtown mall, where we're trying to create a family-friendly environment where we can bring children down there and have peaceful dinners out in the open square. So I don't think it's appropriate. I do think that ultimately our ordinance will be held to be constitutional and that we'll be able to enforce it. Now, with regard to what measures to take, there's 2 things that can be taken. One, we can strengthen the ordinance a little bit. I think there's some aggressive conduct that doesn't necessarily relate to panhandling per se, but it's the same sort of conduct that we can also take a look at. But more importantly, I think what I've heard from a lot of the business owners and a lot of the residents and the people who come to the downtown mall is a little more enhanced police presence down there. Would be an appropriate response to the problem. I've talked to Chief Longo about that. Said, do you need more police officers to do it? And he says, essentially, it depends what kind of police officers you want. If you want police officers that do traditional police work where they sit back and wait for a call, we probably got enough. But if we want the community-style policing where they're out there interacting with the public and keeping the peace, we probably need some more.
And would you say it's a little problem or a significant problem?
I think it varies, but there are times when it's a significant problem.
Mr. Farruggio?
Yeah, I do think it is a significant problem. I spend a lot of time on the mall, a lot of business owners on the mall, and friends that I've spoken to on the mall. And not at every hour of the day, by no means, but the problem itself is significant. What I believe, in my experience, the police officers and the police department do need increased authority? No, they have all the authority they need. Increased tools is what they need. They need to have ordinances that allow them, look, a police officer is not going to go to someone who's laying down on the sidewalk when they don't feel that the authority is there to back them up to say, hey, look, you can't lay down on the sidewalk with your dog and with a sign saying, please feed me. I'm as compassionate as the next person, but there are measures that we need to have in place to have an orderly area where people want to go. I've heard many stories of people that don't come to the mall anymore. So they do need some extra tools. They also need the support from council. The police department needs to feel that city council is supporting them with reasonable measures for taking action on the mall. And the business owners are asking for it, and many of the people that are spending time on the mall are asking for it. A quick story, I've got officer friends that are telling me they see new people in the mall, and they say, hey, how you doing? And I go over and just engage them in conversation. Where are you from? They say, we're from Richmond. Well, what brings you to Charlottesville? Now these are folks that are train hoppers or potentially homeless folks. And I said, well, what brings you to Charlottesville? They said, well, in Richmond they put some new laws down that make it more difficult for us. So they came to Charlottesville. Now, I don't want to hurt anybody, I want to help people, but we can't start bringing more and more folks in from other communities that are coming to our area because it's a target-rich environment. So I think we have to be careful about that. Family, friends not coming down there, or the reduced tax receipts is another thing I've noticed. We have had a drop in tax receipts. Part of that is from Stonefield. But the downtown mall is our lifeblood for the downtown area. Every business person and new tech startup that I talk to loves the downtown mall, so it's got to be not a sterile environment, but a safe environment. Thank you.
Mr. Fenwick?
I think it's a little normal problem. These fellows congregate where there's a lot of people because they like the excitement, not just of cussing in public sometimes, but having the police notice them. One thing we have to remember is that the downtown mall of Charlottesville, well, let me back up. Back in the 60s, many main streets of small communities turned their main street into a walkable mall. And it got probably 70 or 80 of them across the country. We are one of, I think, a half dozen that have remained. And it is one of the most successful downtown malls in the country. It's a draw from UVA, it's a draw from the people who come down to visit Monticello, so it's a very successful mall. Now these fellows, all they have, we just have to make sure they know that there are limits. They used to have benches in Central Place on the downtown mall, and just a simple matter of removing those benches improved the situation tremendously. So I think we're heading in the right direction. What I don't want to see is a lot of police flooding that downtown mall because that's kind of counterproductive to the image we want to present of Charlottesville, and that certainly doesn't promote commerce. So I think it's a normal, what was that, small problem, insignificant or whatever.
Mrs. Szakos?
Hi. I would use the word significant only because I think any problem has significance, but I don't think it's a big problem. I think that we have come through a really serious recession, and I think that cities across the country have seen an increase of people who've sort of dropped out of the bottom of the economy, people who used to work kind of hand-to-mouth, paycheck-to-paycheck jobs, who either lost those jobs or lost their home and are now itinerant and traveling from place to place. And I think that that's something that we've had to deal with because of our economy. But I think that the one thing that we have to remember is that our downtown mall is not a private shopping center. It is our main street. It's a place where people gather. It's a place where everyone comes. And one thing that I have seen in cities across the world, but in Charlottesville as well, is that the more people who are in the space for kind of productive activity, shopping, visiting, behaving in appropriate ways, the less power people who are behaving inappropriately have to disrupt. And we see that on the downtown mall. There are incidents of situations where people are made to feel uncomfortable, but for the most part, if you go to the downtown mall, we've actually, you were talking about people coming less. We did the Downtown Neighborhood Association did a study of asking people, do you come more or come less? About the same numbers, come more. So, there are problems, they are significant, but I think that it's not something we need to panic about. The Downtown Ambassadors was an initiative that I put forward as a way to help the police to have eyes and ears on the ground, but also to help people in the community feel like there's someone they can talk to that's not in an enforcement position, but is in a kind of eyes and ears and advice sort of position. And I would like to encourage people to come to the mall, because the more people who are on the mall, the more positive it is for everyone.
Our next question is the 92nd question. We'll begin with Mr. Farruggio. Official records show that in fiscal year 2012, the city's spending was more than $4,750 per resident. That's 31% more per resident than Manassas, 84% more than Harrisonburg, and more than any other city in Virginia except Falls Church. It's also 66% more than Albemarle County. Do you think the city has a spending problem, and if so, what would you do about it? Mr. Farruggio.
Thank you. We enjoy a wonderful city with many amenities that we appreciate. The problem goes back to over 10 years when my friend Mr. Weber went before council and started telling council that, look, when the assessments of the houses go up, you've got to curtail your spending, even lower the tax rates. It fell on deaf ears then, and it has ever since. This past year, it was discussed on council, and that was a great thing, but no action was taken. When that happened, windfalls of profits were coming in the form of tax revenue, and it was just spent up. Every year, the same budget guidelines were given to just go ahead and make the budget with every available dollar that we're going to get in. That's happened continuously for over 10 years. By spending all that money, we have raised ourselves about 60% more spending now than 10 years ago, which is incredible. We have also, as Buddy pointed out earlier, we've become the second highest per capita spending in the state of Virginia. So we do have a spending problem. And that's not to say you got to start cutting everywhere, but what that does say is we've been doing it wrong for quite a while, and it was not responsible. And if Buddy and I are on council, that's one thing that we're going to firmly get a grasp of and reel back in. Thank you.
Mr. Fenwick?
Charlottesville is approximately in the center of Albemarle County. So as a result, we have many services in Charlottesville that service Albemarle County residents, and Greene County, Nelson County, and counties around us. I know because a lot of parole officers service young men and women from the outlying counties. So in a way that saves our community, the city, county, money by having it in the city. Now, Charlottesville has currently embarked on major capital expenditures. We have a new dam out at Ragged Mountain. We have a McIntyre Road extended. And we have a new firehouse. If we're going to be a world-class city, if we're going to try to attract people to our community to move into the city, if we're going to be a good neighbor to the University of Virginia, which truly is a world-class university, we have to invest the money to make that possible. So as a businessman, I plan to look very closely at the budget, particularly when it comes to consultants or experts, and I hope to bring my experience to bear on that.
Do you think we have a spending problem in Charlottesville, in one word?
No.
Mrs. Szakos?
No. I would say that there are several pieces of data that are important as we look at these figures. It was a very interesting study, and I actually appreciate the fact that they did it. It's a really good start. But one thing is that when we compare city to counties, the cities have a very different role. We maintain our own streets. We do a lot of things that counties aren't expected to do. We have a lot of mandated services that cities do that counties don't. So you can't really compare those. So the city one is much more valuable. And I think one reason that ours ends up high is that part of it is that we have the University of Virginia, which is a wonderful anchor institution for our community. So during the recession, our property values didn't drop as much as they did in many other parts of the state. And so we've maintained a stable economy, whereas other places have really been falling apart. I think we look at our schools. Ours was the only locality in this area whose schools all met benchmarks this year. Other localities were having trouble with their schools, and yet the state this year in the past 5 years, cut school funding to the city of Charlottesville by about 30%. So a lot of that spending has been trying to make whole our schools to make sure that we can continue to teach our kids and keep our schools excellent. The city of Charlottesville actually dropped its taxes from $1.11 to 95 cents when property values were rising. And when property values dropped, we did not raise it again. So we now have the second lowest tax rate of any of Virginia's first cities. So I think that we're doing a really good job. We get a lot of grant funding from other sources that are not tax funding. So I think that we're doing a pretty good job.
Colonel Weber?
Yes, we have a spending problem, and it's not limited to 2012 and anything that talks about what happened in just this past year or so doesn't address the full problem. This thing goes back 20, 30 years or more. Let me quote some things that I wrote several years ago. In 2006, I drafted an editorial for the paper that got printed, where it's very critical of the way City Council was managing and handling the revenues that were coming in. Just a few quotes from there. City Council does not have a good system for evaluating spending requirements and the attendant need for tax increases. Instead, City Council has simply permitted a virtual tidal wave of revenues from rising real property assessments to flow into city coffers with no attempt to assess the need for those additional tax revenues. That statement I made in 2006 stands today. I will tell you that that was not the first time the city council had heard that. That was in 2006, but in April of 2007, I stood before council and I said, 4 years have passed since I first raised the issue of truth in taxation. Every year I have enjoined each of you on city council, as well as the city manager, to be candid with the public about your role in ever-increasing tax burden on the citizens of Charlottesville. I will try one more time. This has been going on for years and years and years. We have a spending problem.
Now a series of yes/no questions, and we'll start with Mr. Fenwick. Do you favor or oppose increasing the meals tax?
I oppose.
Mrs. Szakos.
I think we need to have a community discussion about it.
Colonel Weber.
Question?
Do you favor or oppose increasing the meals tax?
I'm opposed.
And Mr.
I
Farruggio.
oppose.
Next, starting with Mrs. Szakos. Do you favor keeping or repealing the stormwater fee, also known as the rain tax?
Keep it.
Colonel Weber.
Repeal it.
Mr. Farruggio.
I'd have to say repeal it.
Mr. Fenwick.
Keeping.
Next, beginning with Colonel Weber. Do you favor or oppose increasing water and sewer fees?
I oppose.
Mr. Farruggio.
Oppose.
Mr. Fenwick.
Maintain.
Mrs. Szakos. Favor or oppose increasing water and sewer fees?
Oh, oppose.
One more yes/no question, starting with Mr. Farruggio. Do you favor or oppose removing the statues of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson from city parks?
I oppose.
Mr. Fenwick.
Oppose.
Mrs. Szakos.
I don't think it's necessary.
Colonel Weber. Oppose. Now a 1-minute question. And we'll start with Mr. Fenwick. Do you favor or oppose a living wage ordinance? And if you favor it, to whom would it apply? What would the wage be? And would teenagers with no families be as eligible for it as people with dependents?
Well, let me give you a little background. You know, Virginia is not a union state, and that's why this livable wage question comes up. So I'm in favor of a livable wage. The city tries to pay its employees a livable wage, and that sets the standard for industry that comes into our community, for businesses, whether it's high-tech, low-tech, whatever, even in the construction industry. And it's going to set the standard for UVA as well. So a livable wage is something I favor, and I would work as hard as I could to find a way to make that happen.
To whom would it apply? What would the wage be? And would teenagers with no families be as eligible to receive it as people with dependents?
All right, give them to me one at a time now.
To whom would it apply?
It applies to everybody who works.
What would it be?
Well, it would be based on the inflation rate. It would be based on what we pay city employees now.
And would teenagers with no families be as eligible as people with dependents?
If teenagers are working 40 hours a week, full-time, doing a full-time job, they would get a livable wage.
Mrs. Szakos.
Yes, I am for a living wage ordinance. We cannot do a living wage ordinance legally in Virginia that applies to employers other than ourselves and our contractors. So ours applies to the city. It's about $13 an hour. Many of the teenagers who work are either saving for college or helping to support their families, and I think if they're doing a good day's work, they should be paid a good day's pay.
Colonel Weber.
Now, I am opposed to the living wage ordinance. So there's a federal minimum wage that applies across the state, regardless of whether we're a union state or not. And in fact, unions tend to favor the minimum wage laws because their contracts are typically based on it. But we have a federal minimum wage that does apply. I think every study of minimum wage or whatever living wage, whatever you want to call it, whenever you increase it, it increases the unemployment rate, and that particularly hits hard on the first-time entries into the job force, which hits our young teenagers, particularly in the African American community, the hardest. I'm concerned about getting them jobs and getting them getting them the work experience it's going to take to get them a better job later on. I don't think the living wage ordinance helps.
Mr. Farruggio?
I support a living wage. I do not support a living wage ordinance. In the past months and even years, I've spoken to many, many business owners in the city. And when we artificially try to inflate the wage, their minimum hourly wage, what we do end up is hurting the businesses and hurting employment. I've talked to numerous business owners. They're all telling me the same thing. And they're not, in my opinion, in my relationship with them, they're not lying to try to be able to pay people less. So I think a living wage, although well-intentioned, is going to hurt businesses and hurt the very people we want to help. So I would not support it. I do support the city's autonomy to be able to have its own decisions about its own hiring, its own employees, and its own contract work. And I've seen that at work in the city. I've heard complaints about that, but that's not something I would look to revert back.
Next question, a 1-minute question beginning with Mrs. Szakos. City Council had budgeted $3.5 million to dredge the South Fork Ravenna River, Reservoir, but is now considering reallocating those dollars to control the odors that emanate from the Moores Creek wastewater treatment plant. Do you favor or oppose reallocating those funds, and why?
Well, that amount, that allocation, was part of a long negotiation with the county over cost share agreements and how to do the 50-year water supply plan. So it's part of a larger picture. And it came up at our last city council meeting. 2 of the councilors wanted to look at that and ask the Ravenna Water and Sewer Authority Board to consider that. I haven't taken a position on it. I'm not ready to. It's an interesting idea, but I'm not quite sure where I would fall yet on that.
Mr. Weber?
I think I'd almost have to line up there with her in this case. The issue of the $3.5 million is not money that the city owns at this point. As I understand it, it's actually allocated to the Ravenna Water and Sewer Authority, and they're the ones that have to do the reallocation. But I do think that the idea of if it's not going to be used for dredging and it's available, I'd want to hear more details about it in any kind of form, and I haven't paid attention to all the details, but I like the idea of using money that's not going to be used for something and use it for something that would benefit the city, and I think attacking the odors at the water sewage treatment plant would be the right thing to do.
Mr. Farruggio?
As Ms. Szakos pointed out, it is a very complicated situation, and as Buddy pointed out, the money may be joined already and not easily accessible. In theory, I fully support removing that $3.5 million to attack the odor problem down in the Woolen Mills neighborhood. Our neighborhoods are critical importance to the city of Charlottesville. The neighborhood is where you want to reside. You want to go home at the end of the day, go to your castle, and relax with your family and decompress. And if we start doing things, or if we don't fully support neighborhoods, and we start letting neighborhoods deteriorate to the point where someone says, I'm going to move here, I'm going to move there, out of the city, that's crushing our city. So the importance of having the ability to affect the quality of life of the neighbors that live in Woolen Mills is critical.
Mr. Fenwick?
Well, since the RWSA does not want to dredge, and they're dragging their feet on dredging, that allocation of money is going to sit there doing nothing. And the people of Woolen Mills have put up with this problem for easily 10 or 15 years. So rather than have that money sit there doing nothing, I support the odor control, the allocation for the odor control.